Test, test. Test one, test one. Test one, two, test. Testing, 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 1, 2, testing, testing, 1, 2.
Hello. So now we come to the beginning of the rest of our commitment generated by this conference to go on and spend the rest of our lives doing the kinds of things that we all love to do. Just answer me one question. Is this the best conference you've ever attended? Yeah. And I suppose you all know by now that this is not a University of Oregon conference. I've said it before on Thursday, in case anybody had any questions about that. This is not a university conference. It is not a law school conference. It is a conference created entirely by the volunteer work of generations of law students. The current leaders, the current participants, gurus is what some of the groups are called because they lead little teams doing different things like tabling, like childcare and so forth. Other volunteers. It might be interesting, in fact, for you to wander over to the law school at about 3:30 or 4, and you will see a building completely swept clean. All the tables gone and everything organized because that's what these students do. And the students do this simply because of their love for the environment and their love for trying to protect the environment through law. They're the kind of people that if any of you ever have a case and can put together a little money to bring the case, these are the people you need to hire. Not just the leaders, but all of the people, because this is, without doubt, the most public interest-oriented law school in the United States of America. We could spend the next hour and a half recognizing each student who worked to organize it. And I want to make sure you understand, I'm not BSing you when I say it's a student conference. A few years ago, a woman who later became my wife was coming to speak at the conference. She was from Ukraine, and she said, okay, here's when I am, but can I change the time? And I said, I'll try to find out. She said, wait a minute, you're a professor. You just change the time? I said, no, I have to ask the students whether or not they want to change the time. This is truly a student conference, and I think what we need to do is to recognize since we can't recognize everybody, the co-directors who have spent a year putting this together in various ways, constantly working, and probably getting more experience then than they would have got from attending one of my classes in terms of how it is to be a great organizer and lawyer for the future. So I'm going to have each of the current co-directors come up. I'm going to have them step to the microphone, say their name, say where they are from, and then we'll sort of honor them.
My name's Cooper Brinson. I'm a second-year law student, and I'm from Orlando, Florida.
My name is Mallory Woodman. I am also a second-year law student, and I am from Cleveland, Ohio.
My name's Gordon Levitt. I'm a second-year Law and Conflict Resolution student, and I'm from Mosier, Oregon.
My name is Will Carlin. I'm a second-year law student, and I'm from Chico, California.
And my name's Nate Grohl. I'm a second-year law student. I'm from Seattle, Washington.
So on behalf of the faculty members of the University of Oregon Law School, we are presenting each of them with a book signed by all of us, but written by Professor Mary Wood, our great environmental law professor, talking about environmental law for a new ecological age. And if anybody can bring it to this, it's people like this here on the stage and in the audience.
Thank you, Professor Bonine. Good afternoon, and welcome to the fourth and final day of PIELC 2014, Running Into Running Out. On behalf of the 2014 co-directors, 1L representatives, volunteers, and members of Land, Air, Water, we thank all of our attendees, panelists, and keynoters for your participation. Heather Milton-Lightning is the co-director of the Indigenous Tar Sands Campaign of the Polaris Institute in Ottawa, Ontario. Heather was a founding member of the Native Youth Movement, as well as Aboriginal Youth with Initiative Incorporated. With the Indigenous Environmental Network, she built a national Native Youth network to support the organization across the United States and Canada. As a former member of the United Nations Environment Program's Youth Advisory, she lobbied the United Nations and other international forums on Indigenous peoples issues. As a member of Student Legal Advocates for Tribal Sovereignty and on behalf of Land, Air, Water, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Heather Milton-Lightning.
So I just wanted to take a minute to thank the ancestors, the original people of this land, for having us all here this weekend, and for the lovely welcome and opening by local Indigenous people at the Roundhouse the other evening. I couldn't stay for the whole thing, but there's nothing like having a welcome from local Indigenous people to their land. It really means a lot to be here, and I'm really thankful for that. So. My name is Heather Milton-Lightning. I'm Cree, Stoney, Blackfoot, and Ojibwe. I'm from Treaty 4, which is Saskatchewan, Alberta, and part of Manitoba. My community is about 5 hours north of Bismarck, North Dakota. That gives you a better sense of where I'm from. I currently live in the capital in Ottawa, Ontario. So I think one of the things that I really appreciate about our elders and the way they teach Indigenous people is to think with a critical lens. A lot of times when you ask an older person in our communities a question, they're never going to give you the answer because they want to force you to think about it. They want to force you to understand, because a part of learning is going through that critical analysis, and then you know. So there's kind of a process in there. And so my goal today, so you might not necessarily agree 100% with what I'm saying, but I hope that you'll think critically about some of the messages that we're bringing from Indigenous communities all over the country, all over North America, and all over the world. I think it's really interesting that this is the second law conference that I've been to in the last couple of weeks. One of the things that I really think about is the work that happens at a UN level. And a part of that is also really understanding the history of law. And for Indigenous people, that means going back to the 14th and 15th century, when the papal bulls were created by the Vatican that empowered things like manifest destiny, the doctrine of discovery, and many other tools like that. But what that did is it created a foundation for colonial process globally. That doesn't mean just Canada, that means New Zealand, India, Africa, all of these countries worldwide, that there was the God-given right to take the land because our people were not considered human, we were considered savages. And it's a really interesting idea that the melding of church and state at that time could empower such a doctrine that now we see present day in terms of these countries, the United States, Canada, Mexico, and the list goes on and on. But we know that that foundation was created through that process. And for Indigenous people, it's something that we hold clear and dear to our hearts because it created this process of genocide and built the foundation that we now see in Canada and the US. So I think there's some clear links, between the process of colonization and environmental justice. We are all impacted in some way, shape, or form by the creation of these countries, whether that's policy, whether that's where we live. A lot of the work that we do in Canada is really trying to understand our relationship to those colonial regimes that we now call the countries that we exist in. So that may mean, as a non-Indigenous person, as someone from the United States or a citizen of Canada, it's really understanding our own history and how we got to be in this place. Many times, the people that I work with, and examining their own history and their own story of where they come from, many of them came to these countries a long time ago because they were dealing with issues of religious persecution, of poverty, and the list goes on and on. But it's because of that history that we need to really rethink the way we work together and how we deal with these colonial states moving forward, and understanding that they're built on this foundation that's racist. And that doctrine of manifest destiny is what created the problem that we have now. I think one of the things that was really instrumental in my own growth as a young woman back in Canada was really understanding the idea of collective rights. But not only collective rights, the idea of the whole. A lot of times when you go to the UN, or if you're working in different systems, like government lobbying and so on, everything's fractionized. There's environment, there's social issues, there's economics, there's all of these different compartmentalizations of things. But what we understand is that there's a whole picture, and every one of those issues is a part of something. And so therefore, maybe the way we organize should be looking at the whole, right? One of the ways that we do that is we start thinking about our own movements and how we organize as a whole. And I think some of the lessons that we've learned in Canada is that we have to do things like lobbying, we have to do public engagement, we have to do grassroots organizing, but we also need to do direct action. We also need to think about what are the solutions. When we take something down, what are we going to put in its place? And that goes back to a really simple native term or terminology or principle or understanding, is that you never take more than what you need, and you always give something back. And it's clear that we've lost our balance in terms of the environment. It's a great indicator of that loss of balance. But it also goes back to really understanding what is that whole picture and how can we be really effective in what we do. So being that I'm from Canada, these are some slides from Canada. But I think we can look at Canada as a really good lesson, and we can learn some things about Canada that would be really important here in the US. In the last year, we've seen the rise of I Don't Know More. We've seen actions happen all across Canada. In remote communities, people would be round dancing and out in the streets when it was minus 47, minus 37, minus 20. They would be blockading highways, bridges to the US. People were very active. And the real question is why? Well, in the last year, our Harper government, our conservative government, created omnibus bills, Bill C-38, Bill C-45, and the list goes on and on. But basically what it was is a budget bill, an omnibus bill. And they managed to sneak in with the budget bill a whole bunch of legislation that has impacts in a bunch of different variety of ways. So what that ended up doing is that we lost protection to almost all of our waterways except for 97 of them. It changed our Fisheries Act. It changed Indigenous rights, the Indian Act. It affected unions, it affected teachers, it affected everybody. But Indigenous people really seen us as a moment where we needed to stand up and fight for our rights. And it's interesting that the movement kind of is called Idle No More, even though ironically many of our people have been fighting this since the first newcomers came to this land. So a lot of us haven't been idle. But I think the significant thing about it is that we've seen young people, we've seen people that normally wouldn't be political, round dancing in malls and showing up at their local legislative buildings and being active because they believe that this would have an impact on their rights, which it does. So one of the things that I think is really interesting when you look at Canada is we've seen the rise of Indigenous rights, the rise of Indigenous sovereignty. And if you go talk to people in Canada, a lot of people really understand First Nations. They know what Métis is, they know what Indigenous sovereignty is, and that's not across the board. But I will say, if you compare the US to Canada, there's a significant movement there. And that's taken years and years of work to create visibility in the media, in social media and other tools for people to really understand in their lives that this is First Nations land, this is our people's land, and we agreed to share it. So what does that translate to? I will say, Defenders of the Land, a group that I had the honor and privilege of working with, is a network of communities, First Nations, that are dealing with things like land claims, resource extraction, and the list goes on and on. But they created a network to come together to build power, to figure out strategies to basically have the fundamental right to exist, right, in our country. So what did that mean? That meant that we started to see a lot of Indigenous sovereignty allies and people that supported our work that weren't necessarily First Nations people. And if you look at the wampum belts in Eastern Canada, some of them have two lines on them that represent two canoes. And one of them is our people's way of being, and one of them is the agreement with the newcomers. And so I really appreciate this idea because it's foundational in some of the agreements that we made with our government as Canada, that we would exist together, right? And so we've started to see the rise of this Indigenous sovereignty movement, but also with the support of allies. And globally, Indigenous people have been saying in the climate movement and the environment movement and all of these different avenues that when it concerns our land and our rights as Indigenous people, that we need to lead this movement. And so we're starting to see that in Canada, that people are starting to work with us in a much more equitable way. But it still has its challenges. And I think what's very interesting is we've seen some of the bigger, larger, more famous NGOs like Greenpeace and other groups, Sierra Club, and a few others, that now really started to take that idea and translate it into their own organizations. So what does that look like? Well, it means that they're working on a policy that has to do with how they work with First Nations people. And clearly there's been some mistakes. There are some tensions in those relationships that go 20, 25 years back. But clearly, the stakes are very high in Canada because we've lost so much environmental protection. We've lost so much in terms of our movement. And it's time that we really figure out how to work together. And that does mean holding these organizations accountable. Because if you look at an organization like Greenpeace, every single one of its campaigns that it runs in Canada, at some way, shape, or form, intersects with First Nations rights. So therefore, they should be working with our people in a way that's equitable, where we share resources, and that we're seeing them hire Indigenous people and support resources going to these communities that are leading frontline struggles. It's not the best case scenario, but it's moving forward and moving that relationship forward, which is really, really critical as an environmental movement. So I think one of the things that we've seen too is we've been really successful at really supporting frontline community struggles, such as the Elmer Stoughton Camp, the Athabasca Chippewa First Nation, the Beaver Lake Cree Nation, and many, many other communities, KI, Barrier Lake, the list goes on and on, Elsie Booktook. But one of the things that we're seeing is that we can fund these communities directly through things like crowdsourcing. And we can help them with their legal struggles, their legal battles, when they get arrested. They need funding to go out and build cabins to stop the pipelines. We're starting to see a different kind of organizing at a very organic grassroots level. And that's really, really important because I think some of the things that we're learning in our movement in Canada is how to really support communities at the front lines of these struggles. Because many of us aren't always there. I live in the capital. I don't live on the front lines, but my work is dedicated to supporting those people that do. So I think one of the things that we've been focusing on, when it comes to tar sands and huge extractive industry, like I said, this year has been very critical in terms of legislative changes. We've seen a gutting of our environmental legislation, and what's very clear is Harper in his last throne speech talked about the fact that we are a resource extraction-based economy in Canada. His economic action plan includes $650 billion worth of projects proposed to extract resources from Canada. And that's what our economy is based on. It's kind of ironic considering at one time we were a signatory to the Kyoto Protocol. And those days are long gone and will probably not come back anytime soon. But what was really surprising this last year is we were seeing teach-ins happen across the country in Native communities and urban centers around Bill C-45, is that we found out later through the Freedom of Information Act and people doing some really amazing research, is that the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers created Bill C-45. They wrote it, they lobbied it, and they paid for it, and now it's law. So I think one of the things that's very clear is who has the power in our country? Who has the power to change legislation? Who has the power to move our government to ensure that that happens? And it's the people who have the money. And the people who have the money are the people that run industry. Because the way Canada is moving forward is around resource extraction. And who does that benefit? Well, that benefits those people that run those industries. So some key things to think about. We're seeing a divestment movement happen in universities all over the US and Canada. It's really important because our young people need to understand how to follow the money. Who has the power? I was a trainer for quite a long time for the Ruckus Society, and we teach people how to do direct action. One of the things is really figuring out who has the power to give you what you want. In the context in Canada, the people that have that power to give us what we want are no longer government. It's the people who have the money. And so we've been really focusing on figuring out who has that money. Well, it's pension funds. It's the biggest investment banks in the world. It's the Royal Bank of Scotland, the Royal Bank of Canada. The list goes on and on and on. But the reality of the fact is if you follow that money train, those are the people that are actually controlling our government. I think one of the things that is really important in how this relates to the US is when we start looking at this at a perspective from trade agreements. Things like the North American Free Trade Agreement, the MIA, the SPP, the CETA, and the FIPA with China. These are so many different trade deals that Canada is a part of. But I think NAFTA is really, really important to really examine. I was doing some research on the proportionality clause in NAFTA. And what is a part of that proportionality clause is that the US can take 60% of our energy resources, regardless if that's nuclear, hydro, tar sands, natural gas, at any given time. For the US energy security, right? We had the great opportunity of James Cameron coming up to Canada to visit the tar sands. And all of a sudden we've seen all these US senators in the media talking about, well, Canada's our friendly neighbor, We should get our oil and gas from Canada because they're friendly and they're not a country in conflict that we have issues with. But where does that leave us in Canada? That means that we have no energy security plan. We don't have a thought process in terms of adaptation, mitigation, to how to deal with the climate problem. Last month, there was a blackout in Toronto, one of our biggest cities in the country, for 3 weeks. And it was one of the coldest times of the year. You can imagine that that's happening with your average Canadian citizen, but what's it like to be a First Nations person, where in some communities, 25 people in one house. You know, there are some really disproportionate impacts in terms of what we're dealing with and how we need to move forward. I think some key things to think about in terms of Keystone XL, the framing of resource extraction, and the investment from this country into Canada is really, you know, being able to have a critical thought process on the way we're moving forward. You know, today there's a bunch of young people in DC and all across this country that are doing direct actions on Keystone XL. And I think that's really, really amazing to see all the work that's happening in terms of trying to stop this pipeline. But the reality of the fact, and if you look at it from a critical lens, is the Keystone XL battle really hasn't exemplified and uplifted the voices of those that are most impacted, which would be small communities in Houston, people of color. And the real issue with Keystone XL is how do we highlight and bring this story back to ground zero in northern Alberta when we're looking at communities that are dealing with disproportionate impacts of cancer, and the government is not doing anything about it. And because of these legislative changes, they're not going to anytime soon. It's clear that our government is in bed with the oil industry. So I think, you know, when we start looking at this from a historic perspective, and the roots of the problem, if you look at it as like a plant or a tree, it really has to do with the market. It has to do with the creation of these countries. If you look back in the history of Canada, if we use Canada again as an example, many of the newcomers that came here for the fur trade and had a devastating impact on our people. But it was all about resources, looking at land, looking at what we could get as newcomers to this land, right? And so that's part of the root of the problem, is that it's always about resources and what we need. And the root of the problem has ended up with us in a situation where the system is failing us. You know, I'm sure you've been in many conversations and many workshops talking about legal strategies. And for us in Canada, you know, Indigenous people, First Nations people could only get a lawyer since 1960. But we've been able to fight left and right within that legal system to protect our rights. And if you look at the Canadian Constitution in Section 35, it upholds our rights as First Nations and recognizes Aboriginal title, which is huge. But what does that mean? We're starting to see a lot more First Nations people fight trade agreements, fight resource extraction companies, and fight the Canadian government in those legal institutions. The great importance about it, though, is it costs a lot of money to take it to the Supreme Court level. But we've been really successful, and that's something that I'm really proud of. But again, you know, if we look at this as the whole, that litigation strategy is a part of the whole picture, right? You know, we have actions that happen almost all the time on a weekly basis, and that's a key part of it, but also the solution-based ideas. And how do we solve the problem? So one of the things to think about is really looking at who are doing the just transitions at the community level. You know, one of the great programs and great organizations in Arizona is called Black Mesa Water Coalition. And they've been working tooth and nail for many years to protect the Navajo aquifer from coal development, and they've won. And so one of the things is now their challenge is their own people worked in a coal mine. So how do you figure out a way as a community to transition from dirty extractive industry to something that's positive and that will help your community transition? And so one of their proposals is to put up solar farms that are controlled and owned by the Navajo Nation, where the energy and the money that comes from that energy will go back into this community, and that their water source will be protected. There's many other examples, like the Thunder Valley Community Development Corporation in South Dakota that was formed by young people. They were political activists, but then they realized a big part of what we need in our community is a new vision moving forward for our people. And that means bringing back the way. There's a group in Pine Ridge called Oyaku. In the language, that's what it means, bringing back the way. And they're one of the leaders of the Keystone XL fight. So, you know, it's about that finite balance. about what we need to fight in order to get off the addiction to extractive industry, but what do we put in its place? And in a way that is just. You know, I think there's a lot of principles that we hold close in our work. You know, I really love the environmental justice principles because it takes the idea of environment from just being existential, like protecting the trees or protecting the dolphins or the seals or whatever, but it means protecting our way of life and that all people deserve an equitable way of life. And for us in Canada, that's what we're fighting for, is to protect our way of life. Because we signed treaties, we signed all of these deals, and we agreed to share the land, but not to give up our right to exist as people. And that's always, you know, the quandary that we have in Canada, is trying to figure that out, to find balance. Not everyone's going to agree with that, but I think, you know, some lessons and key things that we've learned in Canada is that yes, Indigenous people can lead the movement against climate. We can lead an environmental justice movement in Canada, and we can do this in an equitable way. And it does mean that we are dealing with the impacts of colonialization in our communities. The answers are not black and white. You know, many times communities have been forced into these places of extortion, where we live in abject poverty, and an extraction company will dangle a carrot and say, we'll give you $10 million. And if you're really poor and your community doesn't have a lot of jobs, of course that's going to look good. But people are really starting to question now whether or not that's a good idea moving forward. You know, the tar sands is the biggest human development project on Earth, but we also have the Ring of Fire proposed for Ontario, and it's going to be bigger than the tar sands. The PIELC watershed in the Yukon is going to be opened up. 71% of it will be open for oil and gas and resource extraction in the Great North. And the PIELC watershed is somewhere where you can actually still drink from the lakes and the rivers. And I was thinking about that the other day. I haven't been able to do that in the southern part of Canada in a really long time. Our water sources are polluted. And it begins this question about vision moving forward and what we want as people in this country and in Canada and how we're going to move forward. You know, one of the things that I feel really privileged is that I've been a part of the social forums in the US. We're about to have a Canadian social forum this coming August. You know, there's also the World Social Forum movement. But the idea of creating alternative spaces where we can create the solutions as people. You know, if we really look at the roots of all of these different systems that we're fighting, you know, the systems have failed us time and time and time again. If you talk to Indigenous people locally, they can tell you all the different ways the systems have failed. If you talk to communities of color, they can talk to you about how the systems have failed. A great example in Canada is the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Campaign, our Sisters in Spirit. You know, we're looking at about 1,000 women that have either been murdered or missing, that the Canadian government is doing nothing about. Harper just said, well, we'll give you some money as prevention. But they're not looking into any way of just means for those families that have lost those women in the community. And it impacts all of us in some way, shape, or form. But you know, those are the indicators of how bad the system has failed. And if the system is failing, then maybe we really need to rethink alternatives to that system. Maybe I sound like an anarchist, but I think that's a really good thing. Because we really do need to be creative. And that's what I really appreciate about these institutions, that I hope that young people are coming out of these institutions with critical analysis and looking at the ways the system has failed and the ways that communities can empower themselves. The thing that I really appreciate about Blacklist the Water Coalition and Thunder Valley and all these other projects, including Ona Stoughton and KI and all of these communities, is that they're changing the system failure at the root in their communities. They're taking back the land that belongs to them. They are asserting their power and their political will, and they're building solutions. And that's what we really need to move forward, is what do solutions look like? Each one of us comes from somewhere. That might be an urban center, that might be a rural community, that might be a reservation. But either way, we have to really rethink our relationship to the environment and our relationship to extractive industry. You know, in Canada, we are going to continue to fight back in every way, shape, and form that we can. You know, we've had jingle dress ceremonies, we've had All of our spiritual people are praying for us. And that means a lot. Because it says that the whole is accurate. And that gives me great hope, great vision, that we will be able to change the way things function. Because we're in such a critical place that we have to. And maybe we don't agree on all the ways of moving forward, but that's what these movements have taught us, is that conflict is good. Conflict is inherently a part of us as human beings, but it's the way that we move forward in dealing with that conflict, right? And trying to figure it out. Because oftentimes, politically, I might not agree with what you're proposing, but maybe there's a way that we can work it out so that the best interests of the community and the collective can move forward with this vision. And so maybe it's rethinking and taking away some of the things that we believe and some of our attachments to those systems that have failed us. But that's my greatest hope, is that people will think critically over the last few days about the things that you've learned, the messages that you've heard from different communities and different folks doing different work. It's about how to create that. Because, we can look at examples all across the country that are amazingly beautiful that people are doing this work. So I just want to leave you with that. I think the last thought that I just want to close with is that, right now we're having the North American Caucus for the Working Group on Indigenous Peoples' Rights, the UN system. But we're strategizing around how to hold these countries accountable. And, it's one of the things that we've done internationally is really embarrass Canada and the US at our international level. And we're tiny Indigenous people. Maybe there might be a couple of us that get to these meetings and that go lobby industry and go lobby all of these, where the money is in Europe and the UK and the heads of these institutions. But the thing that stands out to me that I've learned in all of these years is that our power is in our story, and our story is law. Delgamuukw in Canada was a legal instrument that gave us the right in terms of oral history and the legal system. So our narrative is very powerful to Indigenous people, and our story is powerful. And that's something that's really important, because we're holding these governments and these industries accountable to that narrative. What's really interesting is if you look at the tar sands and all the ads that industry puts on Canadian news, they're a direct counter to our story that we're putting out there, which means we're winning. We're having an impact on industry. The biggest money players in the world are counter at directly putting messages out in the media. That means that we're winning. If the financial community is talking about what a risk Indigenous rights are in terms of their investment, then we're winning. And so that's led by Indigenous people, by definitely young women in Alberta, Errol Demonte, Crystal Lehman, Elena Luba-Massimo, Jessie Cardinal, and so many others. And it's my greatest hope that you'll remember these people that are on the front lines of these struggles, also on the US side, like Deborah Whitecoon, Casey Camp, Joki Dow. There's so many, the list goes on and on. But that's what's interesting too, is when we start taking off the layers of all of these things and all of these different systems, we're seeing our women rise up and take positions of leadership. And that to me also is very empowering, because they boss me around. And that feels pretty darn good. So maybe just think critically about what system fail means and what a vision moving forward that you want for your community, but also for your country. And just know that we're going to be up there in Canada and the Great North fighting really hard. But because of those trade mechanisms and because of our dependency on energy in the US, we're locked into this dirty extractive process because of that relationship. So we really need to rethink the way Canada and the US function and how to challenge some of those trade regimes. So I know those things are big picture thinking, but sometimes the best way to challenge the big picture is to build a healthy community and to build together and build relationships that will move forward in a healthy way. So thank you very much for having me.
So she's best known as the 2012 Green Party presidential candidate. And she's definitely not your normal, average, everyday presidential candidate, if such a thing does exist. She didn't start in politics, though. She actually started in medicine. After graduating from Harvard Medical School, she practiced internal medicine for a while, and then made the switch to politics. And I heard a funny story about her first start. She ran for governor, and there was a lot of resistance about her getting put into the debates, but at the last minute, she was let in. When she was there, the other debaters basically dismissed her, weren't really listening to her, weren't responding to anything she said. And so the debate ended and she walks outside. And from what I understand, it was the first and last time that she's ever been swarmed by reporters. Why? Because on the online polls, she was leading by a landslide. A landslide. And the next story I have is Dr. Stein. She's willing to go out on a limb. She's willing to go out onto those front lines and risk getting arrested. And she did so last year in Texas with the tar sands blockade. She physically locked down and was arrested protesting the tar sands pipeline. So if you'll join me in welcoming Dr. Jill Stein to the stage.
Great. All right. A little bit of technology fun to get started with. And it's really a great honor to be here in this incredible conference that's just jam-packed with activists of incredible courage and vision. It's really an honor to be here with you and to be inspired by you. It's also really wonderful to be here at this conference of attorneys. During the last election, I developed great personal appreciation for the profession when I had to engage your services several times to get out of jail and to stay out of jail. So I have a whole lot more appreciation for the legal profession. So in that campaign, when you run a national race, you basically have a chance to get a real bird's eye view of what's going on around the country. And I came away from that race feeling like there is a rebellion in full swing that's going on across the country and really across the world. And it felt like, wow, if only we could make that rebellion visible, because in so many ways we are rendered invisible. And you may recall the demonstration that took place last spring on May 25th, when word got out that people would come out and stand up against Monsanto. And there were, it was like a Facebook campaign, a zero budget campaign with about 3 weeks to get the word out. And what happened was that about 2 million people in 50 countries all around the world came out to say, no, the food system is our right. It does not belong to corporate America or multinational corporations. It was an incredible display for food sovereignty and for food justice. And it was such an astonishing display that within 1 week, Monsanto basically said, okay, we're giving up on Europe. So making ourselves visible actually has real-world impacts. And it left many of us thinking, wow, if 2 million people would come out on the issue of food sovereignty, imagine how many would come out if we had a day that was not only about food sovereignty, but it was about the right to a job, and the right to a living wage, and the right to clean water, and clean air, and a climate for our future, and health care as a human right, and education as a human right. And to bail out our students so that students aren't walking around with $1 trillion worth of debt. You know, what if we all got out for all of that in the spirit of what Heather was just talking about, you know, that we need to find a more holistic way to actually work together for a bigger vision of a world that actually works for all of us. And so out of that, we began to think, well, maybe we should have such a day. In fact, maybe we should have a few of these days. And then the idea came up, well, Earth Day and May Day are 2 days this spring. And they're usually approached separately. You know, on Earth Day, we talk about justice for the climate or for air and water and the planet. And on May Day, we think about justice for people and for workers and for immigrants. Well, what if we connect them? And there are 10 days between them. What if we had 10 days to change course from Earth Day to May Day? A whole campaign, basically, for people, planet, and peace over profit. So that was basically the beginnings of this idea that we really, we need a campaign, and we need it now, because we really do have a state of emergency for people in frontline struggles and for everyday people all across the country and indeed all across the world. So we began to develop this idea of having a global climate convergence for people, planet, and peace over profit, and to come out together as a first exercise in convergence between Earth Day and May Day. And the idea would be to have both an education and direct action campaign to encourage people to find their comfort zone in that spectrum of action, but to encourage everybody to come out in action and to come out together across many fronts of struggle. You know, to not sound, let's see, is this working better? All right, let me just try staying up really close to it. I will eat the microphone here before we're done. So the idea is to not let them continue to divide us and conquer us and keep us in our separate silos, but to use this period of 10 days as an exercise in doing this together. So on Earth Day, to bring out our friends in labor and in economic justice and racial justice and indigenous justice, all coming together not only for Earth Day, but also coming together for May Day, so that we will find collaboration across national borders and across fronts of struggle, and at the same time will lift up a solution that's as big as the crisis that's barreling down on us, because indeed we are facing a crisis on virtually every front. And we call this a climate crisis because, in fact, the climate intensifies all of the struggles for justice, whether it's the struggle of workers for decent wages, the struggle for peace, the struggle for clean air and water. All of these struggles are made much more difficult by the climate crisis. So in a way, it's the climate emergency that offers us really an opportunity to transcend the barriers and the firewalls that have kept us separated. By tradition, we tend to organize within our separate issue groups. And that's great for the powers that be, because it ensures that we will never get to critical mass in order to really change things, and it also enables them to play the game of divide and conquer, and to pit us against each other, and to say that the choice is between jobs or, a livable environment, which is absolutely a false choice. But, this is the prevailing mythology out there. So it's really important that we work together to show in a very concrete way that we can go forward creating jobs and living wages in all jobs at the same time that we solve the emergency of the climate and environmental crises that we're facing. We don't have to lose it all. We can actually have it all. And the idea here is not only, it's not just to have a kumbaya moment, that is to come out together and to, to express community, but to actually push forward on a real solution. And we call that an emergency green economic transformation or an emergency global Green New Deal. So that we're actually calling for specific policy measures, including jobs as a human right for everyone at living wages, including health care and education as living rights, as human rights for everyone, and including 100% clean renewable energy by 2030. We can do that, and in doing that, we can also fix our economy at the same time that we avert the climate crisis. So we're really for those who don't follow the, the policy wonk pieces of this, there's a wonderful study that came out of Stanford University last year by Mark Jacobson, showing, it's a detailed study, in fact, showing that we can not only move to 100% wind, water, and sun distributed energy by 2030, but we can do it in a way that actually pays for itself, because by removing the poisons that we've taken, we've come to take for granted, the poisons in our air, in our food, and in our water, we become so much healthier so quickly that it's more than enough savings to actually pay the cost of transition. And all they looked at there in that study was the savings from pollution prevention on health. They did not look at the savings from the health benefits of eating healthy, sustainable local food. And when you add that in as well, it becomes all the more an economic benefit to make this transition. So the line that we're given that it's too expensive and that we can't afford to do it is a lie. And it actually, we need to challenge that, absolutely, and to let people know that we can not only do this, but we can save an enormous amount of money in the process. So the climate convergence is sort of built on this notion that there is a movement for democracy and justice, which is actually sweeping the globe. And we've seen that in the democracy revolutions in the Middle East. Here you see Tunisia and Turkey, and that was Tahrir Square. Indeed, these are struggles that are very much ongoing. They haven't stopped. But the push, the uprising for justice is incredible and strong and continuing. We saw it very much in the Occupy Wall Street movement, which lives on, even though it was, brutally chased out of our public squares. It may have been evicted, but it's very much alive and well in our communities. We see it in the anti-austerity movements in Europe and in South America as well. We see this movement for democracy and justice in the student revolts. And here you see the student movement in Quebec You see the movement in Cooper Union in New York City, the takeover of Governor Scott's office in Florida by the Dream Defenders, the student debt movement as well, which is very much alive and in force. We see this movement in the uprising of teachers, in the Chicago teachers' strike, who were standing up not only for their dignity as teachers, but for the needs of our communities, to have schools in the public interest, public schools that are truly serving our communities and serving young people, and which have not been commodified into high-stakes testing for essentially private institutions in the modern version of the charter school movement. We see this in the workers' rights movement now. 1 year ago, a little more than a year ago, at the end of 2012, we saw the beginnings of the fast food workers who, about 200 workers came out in New York City who dared to stand up for the first time in a long time for living wages and for their rights to unionize. Well, 1 year later, those walkouts and strikes were happening in over 100 cities in every region of the country within 1 year. That was an incredible spread of this movement for workers' rights. And here you see the some workers at Walmart also standing up for their dignity. We've seen it in the immigrant rights movement, particularly strong a few years back when there were millions and millions of people out in the street standing up for immigrant rights as human rights, for really the full rights of citizenship to which they should be entitled. With the exception of the Native Americans and the First Nations, we are all immigrants in this nation and are part of what has made us strong. Immigrants, and I must add slaves who were brought here through no choice of their own. We've seen an incredible movement in the eviction blockades that have taken place to keep families in their homes. And of course, the incredible courage and strength of our First Nations and the Native Americans who've really who are very much at the forefront and at the heart of the defense of our climate and of Mother Earth. The First Nations and Native Americans have really been the first line of defense for this planet and the people who depend on it, and will continue to be our last line of defense. And we're very grateful for your heroism and courage. And then building on that courage, we have the whole broader climate movement, and particularly the tar sands blockade, to whom we are incredibly grateful, as well as the fights to close down our nuclear power plants. And we've had incredible successes over the past year, with many nuclear power plants being closed, many contracts being canceled, and many upgrades also being canceled, for good reason. Because what we see happening at Fukushima could happen basically at any nuclear power plant, because we have nowhere to put the waste. No matter how good or modern or up-to-date the nuclear power plant is, there is nowhere to put the waste. And just recently we've heard about recent leaks at a nuclear weapons facility storage plant, again underscoring that there is no safe place to put the waste. We need 100% clean, renewable energy, wind, water, and sun. And we see this movement for democracy and justice, again, alive and well in the movement to stop GMOs and the commodification of our food system, and also in the movement to stop fracking. So we're very grateful to all of these movements, which make the point that we can make this actually a very powerful tipping point to take back the promise of our democracy and the peaceful, just, green future that we deserve. We are at this tipping point because we're really at the breaking point, and people have begun to stand up to push back. We're at the breaking point for people and the planet, for our economy and our democracy. As Heather was mentioning, all of these things are very much interconnected. We can't fix one without fixing the other. We need a holistic movement. And, you know, we're used to thinking about all these separate crises. You know, we've got the Wall Street bailouts and unemployment and declining wages and the corporate free trade agreements and the attacks on Medicare and Social Security and the foreclosures and debt, expanding wars, the attack on our civil liberties and immigrant rights and food security and all the rest. And we're kind of standing there in the middle saying, oh my God, you know, which one am I going to work on? And, you know, the truth is you really can't work on them one at a time. Well, let me qualify that. We do need to work on them one at a time because these are all very difficult issues and they require an enormous amount of watchdogging. But at the same time that we work on particular issues where we have expertise or fronts of struggle that are particularly impacting our communities, your particular community where it lives, it's really also important for us to join together. And you may have recalled hearing this saying from centuries ago. Sailors used to say, there was a saying among sailors when they got into a storm, that you need one hand for yourself and you need one hand for the ship. We need to begin organizing in that way, where we work on what's close at hand, but we also work together. So many people, you know, are very focused on the economic crisis. To look at polls, most people are thinking about where is their next meal coming from, how are they going to keep, how are they going to pay their mortgage or their rent, how are they going to keep from becoming homeless, how will they pay down their student debt, how will they, enable their son or daughter to be able to attend college or some kind of post-high school education, which is really essential for economic security. And so it's really important that we be able to address that as we address the solutions to the climate or our environmental struggles. And, you know, the reality is, the numbers are kind of on our side, because 1 out of every 2 Americans right now is in poverty or low income, according to the Census Bureau, and 39 million young people, college students and recent graduates, are in debt. 1 out of every 3 African American men is essentially held hostage by the prison industrial complex and the school to prison pipeline. You add those numbers up, and you know what? We've got a quorum. We have enough to actually take charge and really change the direction of things. Which, again, I think underscores the point that we need to be putting out solutions that are really convergent solutions that solve all of these things together. And the one other issue here I want to mention is that, the wealth disparities get bigger all the time. And one of the most powerful ways I have seen to drive that home is in the following picture. People can get really lost in the statistics. You know, the numbers kind of make the eyes glaze over. But if you think about this one as a picture, the statistic is that the top 1% has 50% of the wealth, and the poorest 50% has 1% of the wealth. But let me give you the picture. The picture is 100 people are in the room, and there are 100 loaves of bread. What that statistic says is the best nourished person in that room, the 1 out of 100, who is the 1%, gets 50 loaves of bread. And the 50 people in the room who are the most malnourished, the most, verging on starvation, they get to share 1 loaf of bread. And that is the story of the American economy right now. So, it's absolutely immoral and untenable, unstable. It is deep transformational change that's waiting to happen. And of course, you know, there is no solution on the horizon. The response of both major political parties is basically the corporate trade agreements, which are actually going to make it worse. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is essentially NAFTA on steroids. It will send more jobs overseas and undermine wages at home. The Wall Street bailouts continue. The economy continues to sputter, although it's doing quite well for the top 1% for corporations and banks. So this is change waiting to happen. This is just a picture here of poverty rates, and you can see that they have been climbing since approximately 2000. And likewise, household income has been on the decline, actually also since the year 2000. So this is just showing you some of the numbers behind these assertions. Reliance on food assistance is absolutely critical now, just as they are in the process of cutting it for the second time in a couple of months. And here's their solution, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And what this is the handle of a toilet, which is the symbol for a campaign called Flush the TPP. I won't take the time to go into it now, but you know, suffice it to say that the Trans-Pacific Partnership is deadly for workers' rights, for protection of the environment, for health care, for affordable pharmaceuticals, and indeed for national sovereignty, because it essentially allows multinational corporations to drag us into their tribunals and fine us for lost future profits, for our efforts to assert our democratic rights, to protect our communities, our workers, and our environment. So I don't understand why any proponent of the Trans-Pacific Partnership is not considered a traitor to the country for selling. What they've done essentially is sold, you know, our national sovereignty. And that is sort of that's kind of like a picture in a nutshell of what our government has become as it's been entirely hijacked by the 1%. So turning now to the climate side of the crisis, and I want you to just bear with me for a moment, because the point here is that we don't have to be in crisis. This is completely preventable and fixable, but it really requires us to act now. So to underscore the necessity of acting now, I'm going to tell you some difficult truths, most of which you probably know. In fact, you probably know this a whole lot better than I do, but for the benefit of those who may be listening, let's just put it on the record. So we do have an incredible climate catastrophe that's going on now. According to a recent report delivered at the United Nations, this climate currently is killing almost 500,000 people per year, including 1,000 children per day, who are dying largely from the impacts on food and drought. That is from starvation. And the costs in financial terms are well over $1 trillion a year, but they will get much bigger. And in terms of storms, you know, we're seeing record numbers of billion-dollar storms, as well as floods, killer heat waves. You may recall last summer in Arizona, the news that you know, oh my goodness, airplanes couldn't fly. It was too hot even to fly because they just didn't have the data to calculate how long it would take to lift off and to land, because aerodynamics changes in that kind of heat. You know, life should be so tough that we couldn't fly. You know, that might be a really good thing. But suffice it to say, it's an indicator of how out of whack the system is. This photo here shows a heat wave in Europe in 2003 that had temperatures of about 105 or 107 degrees for a week at a time, and over 40,000 people died. And as we get to warmer temperatures, we're not going to see 105 and 107 degree heat waves. We'll be seeing 115, 125 degree heat waves, which people cannot survive, where electrical systems will be browned out and blacked out so that we cannot, protect ourselves indoors. And what is said to be the greatest threat to human populations is that those killer heat waves essentially wipe out food crops and livestock. It doesn't take very long to, basically wipe them out. So these are very problematic, and of course the forest fires that we've seen and the ongoing drought, which we're seeing right now in California. And yes, they've had a little bit of rain this last week, but it doesn't begin to bring them even halfway up to the reserves that they should be at. So they're not even halfway there, and this is the rainy season. California produces about half of our fruits and vegetables. We're going to be paying the price for this drought all over the country, actually, and all over the world as the cost of food goes up. So I'll skip over this. We're paying the price right now. It's been widely agreed on that 2 degrees centigrade is sort of this critical threshold, that if we go beyond that, we're in real trouble that will essentially dismantle civilization. And many people, it should be added, are in real trouble right now, are being killed, are having to leave their homes, and so on. So there are enormous and devastating impacts already at 0.8 degrees centigrade. So we're not even halfway there to what they're saying, is allowable. But that said, this is what the various reputable scientific agencies are predicting, that we're going to be at 4 degrees by 2100. And more recently, the Tyndall Center, which is sort of like the NASA of the UK for weather, is predicting 4 degrees by 2050, 2060, or 2070, meaning that, it's kind of the end game right now, that we are on track for absolutely devastating impacts. And we see, essentially the science tells us that you'll have a 40% reduction in food productivity in agriculture once you get to 4 degrees. And the heat waves that I mentioned and extinctions are the other piece of this, because as you may know, we are in the midst right now of what's been declared to be the 6th great extinction in the history of life on the planet. And in fact, EO will be at 10,000 times the background rate of extinctions now in the Amazon, and about 1,000 times elevated more generally. So this is an absolute state of biological emergency. There's no way that the web of life can continue to unravel it as it is, and for us to think that we're not going to unravel with it. We are perhaps the most at-risk species of all right now. So it's very important for us to take this seriously and fix it, because we can fix it. But we have to take charge in order to do that. And I want to explain these dots here, because I wanted to see, what does all this mean? If you actually look at the predictions of various scientific agencies about how high up we're going to be, when. So just to make the point that when all this started in 2007, you had the IPCC, the UN scientific body, saying, we'll be at about 1 degree warming in 2100. And then as more science came in, well, it was not just 1 degree, it would be 2 degrees, and then it would be 3.5. And then in 2009, other scientific agencies were saying, well, it looks more like 6 degrees or 7 degrees out in 2100. And then they started bringing the dates closer. The Hadley Center saying it'll be 4 degrees by 2060. The United Nations Environmental Program saying, well, it'll be 5 degrees by 2050, and so on. The point here, and then the other piece is 2 degrees. This used to be called the border of how high we could go. So This shows your degrees of warming that are predicted. This is the year in which the prediction was made. I'm sorry, the year in which that warming is going to happen. So the bottom line is that the predictions, more recent predictions, keep saying that we're going to have higher and higher warming closer and closer to now. So it becomes impossible to say, oh, don't worry, it's my grandkids, you know, or their kids, or their kids. As Jim Hansen actually said last night, we're looking at, for example, the breakup of Greenland within the lifetime of people who are alive today. And that means several meters, translated into feet, 12, 15, 20 feet of sea level rise within the lifetime of people who are here in this room. That is not something that we can survive. So it underscores why we have to take this very seriously, why our lives, not just our children's lives, but our lives actually depend on fixing this and fixing it now. This just shows how the Arctic, back in 1979, the Arctic used to be pretty much white, and by 2007 it was half gone, and somewhere between now and 2030, you know, we'll see the Arctic disappear. I want to just quickly mention methane. Are people familiar with the methane issue? Yeah, all right, great. So methane has it's a new thing. It's only been studied really for the last 5-7 years or so, but what's coming out is not a pretty picture. The bottom line is that methane is frozen in this so-called permafrost. A lot of it is right here in the East Siberian Arctic shelf. There's loads of it there. As the climate warms, and as the oceans warm in particular, you see this permafrost starting to melt and methane beginning to bubble up. And this article from the National Science Foundation, which was published in 2010, actually said that, you know, it's coming out at an alarming rate, and some of the scientists have actually described areas of this East Siberian Sea shelf as looking like seltzer water because there's so much bubbling up that's coming. So what does that mean? Every red dot here is a bunch of CO2. 100 gigatons, but it doesn't matter what the label is. It's a lot. 2.5 of these dots represents all of the fossil fuel emissions since the Industrial Revolution, okay? So this is all the CO2 we have ever burned. This is what we are putting out per year right now. It's like a quarter of a dot. And this is what would come out of the tar sands in Alberta if we allow the pipelines and the pipeline trains to run. It will basically equal all the fossil fuel emissions of since industrialized civilization. So that's like a doubling of the hit. And this is what could bubble up in what's called one methane burp from the East Siberian Sea. It dwarfs all the other, and the reason for this is that methane is from 20 to 100 times more powerful than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas. So methane is extremely dangerous. That's what comes out of fracking. This is what natural gas is, which is another reason why we don't want to allow fracking to take place at all. So the point here is that we don't want to get warm enough to start accelerating this bubbling up of methane, because if you look at that methane in reserve there, you know, it really should be called a methane bomb. And all of these things here are triggers for a methane bomb. And that's another reason why we can't go forward with the tar sands or the coal trains or all the rest of the fossil fuel extractions that are extremely dangerous and lethal. They're all essentially triggers for the methane bomb. Let's see if I can get this to change. It takes a minute because the next slide All right, let's try it again. The next slide has the sum total, if all the methane came out. Give it a second. See, it doesn't want to go there. It just skipped right over. Okay, I'm not going to make you look at that unless it decides it wants to go back. Let me see. All right, there it is. Had to make the dots really small to get them in, but that's how much, climate warming is contained in methane. Okay, so these are, all of these things here can trigger enough warming to push us over the edge on methane. So again, this just underscores why we have to keep doing what we're doing, why we are fighting the fights we're fighting. And this is a slide I think Jim Hansen also showed last night about the melt that's taking place on Greenland. This has accelerated 500% over the last decade. Has anybody seen Chasing Ice, the beautiful movie? Yeah, it really shows how these ice sheets are almost like living creatures, and you don't want them to get into a condition where they're breaking down, and that's where we appear to be going with Greenland. And Greenland itself holds about 24 feet of sea level elevation, which would be absolutely devastating. It's basically goodbye to your coastal cities, and then more from the other ice sheets. So this is all what we can prevent by doing what we need to do. This just shows Boston, my hometown, what it would look like as that melt begins to take place. So here it is now, and you basically lose the coast. The next couple slides I'm just going to skip through because I think you already know. They essentially show that the response of the current administration, like the last administration, is essentially smoke and mirrors. All of the above energy policy is lethal, it's deadly. Good energy does not balance bad energy. Nature does not read renewable energy. Nature reads greenhouse gases, period. So you can't compensate for more greenhouse gases by having more renewable energy. It just doesn't work that way. That's like saying, I can feed my kid poisonous pesticides and lead and arsenic because I'm also giving them spinach and blueberries. Doesn't work like that. So in the last election, the debate was who can produce more pipelines, who can ram through, permits more quickly. That's not going to do it. I'm going to skip over this commentary on the crisis in our democracy, which I think we're well aware of, which we're, feeling the heat of in the militarized police and the restrictions on freedom of speech and press and freedom to protest and all that. So the good news is that this is fixable with an emergency green economic transformation. We should be demanding nothing less than that. And if we stand up together, we have critical mass to actually make that happen. So, specifically, we're calling for 100% employment, 100% clean renewable energy, wind, water, and sun by 2030. We need a Marshall Plan and a Manhattan Project all rolled into one. It's like how brain dead is Congress and Washington. All they can think about is bailing out Wall Street. So we need to stand up for what we need now. I mean, we did this during the Great Depression. We established a New Deal, which brought millions of jobs online within months, actually. And by creating those jobs in the areas of the green economy, we can get it fixed and do it quickly while we put a halt to climate change and, by the way, also make wars for oil obsolete. And I'll just mention these other little perks, also essentially pay for themselves. We could talk about them at greater length another time. But it's really important for us to have a holistic agenda. The approach of, shall we say, the traditional climate movement has been to focus very narrowly on climate. And the problem is that it leaves out most people who are really struggling to survive from today to tomorrow. So we really need to define, or I should say to create, a movement which is a convergent justice movement and which essentially solves all of our needs, because we can't meet any one of them without actually meeting them all. In my work as a healthcare provider, nobody ever came into the office and said, could you please fix my left kidney? That's all I really care about. You know, I don't care about my lungs or my heart or my brain or my liver or my pancreas or anything like that. You know, just do the one. We know that, you know, to live, to survive, we need jobs, we need an economy, we need clean air and water, we need a climate, we need a healthcare system. You know, so we have to work on the individual pieces, but we need to call for a convergent solution that actually meets all of these needs and makes it possible for us to have a secure, just, democratic, healthy, green future. It comes as a package or it doesn't come at all. There are a variety of financial reforms that are built into this, as well as democracy reforms that I won't take the time to go into, but I do just want to underscore that it pays for itself, and there are a whole variety of economic analyses that underscore this, and they have, you know, different amounts of savings, but they all essentially come up with the same conclusion. We cannot afford not to go forward with an economic transformation. And here, of course, is one of the vast reserves of wasted money, and that is in the U.S. military budget, which is not only wasteful, it's downright dangerous, and it gets us into all kinds of conflicts where, you know, we are not only entering into the conflict, we've done an awful lot to create the conflict, knowing that we have the troops to go in and impose our solution on it. But we see how effective those solutions are right now in Iraq and Afghanistan, where after $5 or $6 trillion, thousands and thousands of American lives and hundreds of thousands and millions of civilian lives, what actually has been accomplished? Not much. We are back to ground zero in Iraq right now. There's a civil war, essentially, that's about to break out. It's really sort of raging under the radar right now, and same for Afghanistan. So militarism is not a foreign policy. We need a foreign policy. So I'm going to just wrap up here with Alice Walker's famous words that one of the biggest ways people give up power is by not knowing we have it to start with. In fact, when you add up the numbers of people who are in poverty, who are in debt, who don't have a future, who are threatened with foreclosure, we have critical mass, we have critical vision, we have the blueprints for how to fix this. We have the numbers, we have the energy. There is a movement for democracy and justice which is sweeping the planet, and we can move that forward. We have the courage and the vision of the First Nations and the Native Americans, who are really very much the guiding vision of how we have to go forward. And I want to just direct you to the website, globalclimateconvergence.org, which is sort of the organizing hub for Earth Day to May Day. And again, that's globalclimateconvergence.org. And communities are actually organizing all over the country right now, and we hope are beginning to organize outside of our borders as well. Because by standing up, which many people would do anyhow in the course of Earth Day and May Day, if we do it in a way that says people, planet, and peace over profit, we are in this together, and we are calling for an emergency green economic transformation now, and we're not going to give it up until we get it. We're here for the long haul. This is the first exercise. Yes, thank you. This is the first exercise this spring in convergence, out in the street, in direct action, and we hope to raise our voices as loud and big as we possibly can, make ourselves seen and heard, as 1,000 movements to start synchronizing our watches and get out on the same days and at the same times. And there's a lot of organizing that is actually going on through that website. We can help connect you to other people in your community and make sure that they hear about you. We have sample literature and flyers and Facebook postings and so on. If we got 2 million people out on the single issue of food sovereignty in about 3 weeks with a Facebook campaign, imagine how many we can get out for peace, justice, planet, a sustainable future, people, for the whole 9 yards. For us to stand up together and say that we're here for the long haul, we're not going away. We're going to be here until this is done and reclaim our future. And look out, world, because here we come. Thank you all so much. Let's make it happen. So I guess we have just a few minutes for questions if people want to make quick questions or comments. Okay.
All right, so we're going to have a couple questions here. You could keep it down just a little bit. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you for coming, Dr. Stein. I really appreciate all the work that you do and your obvious dedication to this. I've been working this struggle for a long time myself. In fact, if that picture in the bottom right there had been a little further to the left, I would have been in there. I was on a panel yesterday on the topic of green energy and green technology. And it's an issue that strikes very close to home for me because I'm a resident of Salt Lake City. And the Salt Lake Valley has, as you probably know, the worst air pollution in the country. And the largest source of pollution is a copper mine. And copper, as well as iron ore and other materials, are necessary for wind turbines, solar panels, and these other green technologies. And so I'm wondering if you can speak to some of the contradictions that are inherent in these green technologies and your perspective on that. Thanks.
Yeah, the question was sort of the problems with some nuclear technology and then in other green technologies as well. Yeah, and for me, the nuclear technologies are, what should we say? They're really not, they're just a game stopper. They're a showstopper. There's no solution to the critical problem of nuclear technologies. In some of the renewable technologies with wind and solar, there are invariable problems, but there are ways to mitigate them. So, for example, instead of doing large fields of solar panels, which occupy, often very sensitive open space, we should be doing rooftop solar and distributed solar on people's homes. For wind towers, far less impacts when communities have a chance to decide where they are going to place their wind towers, rather than having these massive wind tower developments offshore and onshore. So there really needs to be a lot of process and community input. And I would also add that we need to pull back on our energy use, and we need to change how we live. We need relocalized economies so that we're not, getting our food from 1,000 miles away and so on. So I think, it really requires community discussion and community input to try to mitigate, potential impacts. And above all, conservation is going to be really important, and living with a small footprint.
Hi, Dr. Stein. I'm so glad you're here. I'll be hosting you for dinner, by the way. My name is Holly Burley Price. I am the local coordinator for the Green Party here in Oregon. We have a presence in Oregon, and my question to you, Dr. Stein, is how do we get the fence sitters that are in the Democrat Party still, that are liberal green Democrats who are waiting for change in the Democratic Party that will never come?
So, you know, the question there, I guess, do you want me on this mic here too? Yeah, sorry about that. We have a radio audience too. So the question was, you know, how do we get people to move who are sort of sitting on the fence? And I guess the question was intended mainly politically. How do you get people to sort of, what should we say goodbye to abusive political relationships and move on to a healthy, mutual political relationship? It's very much, in my experience, like, you know, like sort of getting out of a bad, abusive relationship. And you can only tell people so many times, and they kind of have to discover it for themselves. But in the time that you would spend trying to convince somebody who's not ready for a healthy political relationship, you know, in the time that you would spend trying to convince them, you could get word out to 1,000 young people and unemployed who are ready to get on board and to start moving.
Hi, Dr. Stein. Thank you for coming. I just have a quick question, which I imagine would be a short response. Do you have any intentions of running in the next presidential election?
So the question was, do I have any intention of running in the next election? And I would have to say that I have never had any intention of running in any election. And I have occasionally been recruited. And, you know, I consider elections what shall we say, sort of a byproduct of activism. And, you know, I feel like our job is to be activists. And electoral activism is just one tool that we can use. And it's a very compromised tool and a difficult tool, but sometimes it has impact, and it sort of helps build potential for electoral change down the line. Which is to say that I very much believe in electoral engagement, but for me it doesn't take over. The important thing is to keep working and pushing. I think it's very important that there be an alternative in the upcoming election. I think that Hillary is not going to do it for us. And it's very important for us to have a voice that's not bought and paid for by Wall Street and corporate America in the upcoming election.
We found another mic here, just in time for the last question.
Hi, I just want to tell you your lecture was perfect, your ideas are perfect, and your mind is perfect. There's one thing I think you might have added was the issue of animal rights and the whole fact that we can't eat a meat-based diet in 7 billion people on a planet. You know, even the fisheries are completely depleted in the oceans. So, when I add something to that?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. The point was that an animal-based food system is very problematic, especially in the world that we live in of 7 billion people. And, you know, I'll just, you know, respond to that saying that, yeah, it's really true. It's going to be very hard for us to feed 5 billion people going forward, let alone 7 billion. And it's enormously more efficient to be eating lower on the food chain. There's a really interesting example. Cuba went basically not completely vegetarian, but they greatly reduced their reliance on animal food when the Soviet Union oil pipeline to Cuba went down. And overnight, their health statistics, it was like a health miracle that we can't buy with $3 trillion a year. That's what we spend on our sick care system. But because they went to a green economy overnight, so they were no longer polluted by fossil fuels, they had a more active transportation system because they had to do some walking and biking, and they also had to start eating much lower on the food chain. They didn't give up eating meat, but they ate a whole lot less. Overnight, their obesity rates went down by 50%. Their rates of death from diabetes went down 50%, and their death rates from heart attacks and strokes went down 30 to 35%. We cannot buy this with $3 trillion a year in this country. It underscores what a healthy thing a greener economy and a greener diet would be for all of us. Thank you.
And I think we'll have time for about one more question if you're...
Sure, sure.
I just want to say I voted for you. It was your arrest record that made me, that was the final straw. And I wanted to ask about something called CCA's Community Choice Aggregate, and I think Paul Fenn was the creator of that, and it's doing a good job of trying to take big energy, big utilities out of the hands of monopolies and into the people. And what I'm concerned about, and I want to know if you're aware, and so I'm not sure what my question is, but I'm concerned that that fossil fuels are getting in on this bandwagon, and there's a lot of people, progressives, a lot of well-intentioned people that are being fooled by partnering with fossil fuels. So can you...
Great, really good point, and there's a very important principle in what you're talking about, which is community and democratically controlled energy. And we do need to democratize the energy sector and have community control. At the same time, we want to keep pushing towards wind, water, and sun, clean renewable energy, no fossil fuels, which is why, I think it's really important for us to come together, around this agenda of 100% employment and 100% clean renewable energy by 2030, and to move them both forward together.
All right, and with that, we conclude the 2014 Public Interest Environmental Law Conference. Thank you again, Heather Milton-Lightning, for coming up. Thank you again, Dr. Jill Stein. And again, thank you all for coming. Without you, this conference would not be a thing. So see you again next year.